Welcome to everyone. I'm Dan Kim, the CEO of SLBST, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today for this exciting webinar program. First, I would like to thank the University of South Florida for hosting and supporting SLBST, as it was here at USF to first link hydroxychloroquine and its potential use in endometriosis. And we hope to advance more with data and conclusive clinical evidence as well. Our agenda today is packed with insightful discussions and valuable information as we have lined up expert speakers who will cover a range of topics in patient perspectives, medical insights, and treatment of endometriosis. Further, we will discuss the role of inflammation and potential therapeutic targets. While this is not a request to raise funds, our goal is to introduce SLBST. Our management team is available to address any questions and will follow up with you should you have any questions. I just want to introduce the first three folks from the SLBST management team, and then I want to introduce Lisa as well. To begin with, from my right, going to left, Beat Wiedemann, who used to lead preclinical research at Novartis, and has had a number of therapeutic responsibilities, including autoimmune disease and infectious disease as well. Mark Connell has an international experience in pharmaceutical operations, and I myself have opened up very different degrees of marketing and sales support over the years. At this time, I would like to introduce Lisa Halvorson, who is a renowned specialist in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. Dr. Halvorson brings 30 years of experience and has made significant contributions to the field through her research and clinical work. She formerly served as the Chief of Gynecologic Health and Disease Research Branch at the NIH. Lisa?
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for that kind introduction. So hello all. It's my pleasure today to moderate the presentations. As you just heard, the first will be a patient presentation who will explain the journey that patients go through and help us understand the impact of this disease on women's lives. The next, then, I will provide a quick presentation on background in endometriosis. I think many of you on the call really are well acquainted with this disorder, but that will level set for all of us. And then Dr. Alex Kotlyar will present current treatment options, as well as more description of the data available currently on HCQ. And I'll provide a little more information about the speakers as we move ahead. Following the presentations, there will be a question and answer session. So we ask that you put in your questions as we go along, but that you hold them any expectation for an answer until the end of the presentation so that we can get through these relatively efficiently. Thanks. So next session, next slide, please. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Sabrina Geraci-Yee. She herself is an accomplished scientist, having received her PhD in marine biology from Stony Brook University, and she's currently a teaching professor at Hofstra University. Again, as you'll hear, these accomplishments are particularly remarkable in view of the chronic pain and multiple surgeries that she has had to endure over many years. Sabrina has generously agreed to share her story, and I welcome her. Could you please put Sabrina on the screen? If not, we can stay on this slide. Why don't you go ahead and get, there you go. Go ahead, Sabrina. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Dr. Halvorson for that wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank Mark Connell for inviting me here today to share my endometriosis story. If you missed my introduction, I'm Dr. Sabrina Geraci-Yee, and I am not a medical human doctor. My doctorate is in marine science, and I was actually a doctor to marine animals as a disease pathologist. Now I'm an assistant teaching professor of biology at Hofstra University. As an endometriosis survivor and committed educator, I'm excited to be here today to share my journey and help spread knowledge and awareness about living with endometriosis. I was your average normal teenage girl until I went through puberty. I started experiencing painful periods with heavy bleeding. But these symptoms run in our family, and like most women, you dismiss them and accept them as normal. However, my pain started becoming more and more frequent, beginning as early as ovulation with extreme bloating. I literally needed 2 sets of clothing. Then approximately 2 years after my first period, I collapsed in excruciating pain. Pain like I had never felt before in my life. And I had felt pain before. I had broken bones, sprains, dislocations, stitches, etc., reflective of a very active and perhaps a little accident-prone childhood. So my mother called the pediatrician, and I was rushed to the children's hospital since I was only 16. Scans showed a potential appendicitis as well as an ovarian cyst with torsion. I was rushed into emergency laparoscopic surgery. Turns out the appendix was inflamed but not infected, and the cyst was drained. We thought that was the end of that. Little did we know that was just the beginning. My pain, it never really went away. My mom brought me back to the doctor and the hospital, but they just couldn't find anything wrong with me. Then came the infamous line, no woman should ever hear from a GYN. Some women just have painful periods. That one phrase ignited my mother, and she was determined to find out what was wrong with me. Luckily, my mother had an amazing GYN, and she suspected I had endometriosis. So about 6 months after my first surgery, we decided to do a second surgery, an exploratory lap. So after 2 surgeries, multiple hospital and doctor's visits, an assortment of scans and tests, and several rounds of bed rest, I finally had my diagnosis. At 17 years old, during my senior year of high school, I was diagnosed with endometriosis. In 2006, we started with the first course of treatment: birth control pills, vitamins and supplements, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or NSAIDs, and of course, opioids. We also explored differential diagnoses, so I saw a gastro specialist and had my first colonoscopy experience at 18 years old. We learned that I had many intestinal occlusions, likely from the endometriosis, which certainly explained all of my GI symptoms. I also started to experience widespread pain and chronic fatigue, and was subsequently diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Now, this wasn't too surprising, as women with endometriosis are twice as likely to have fibromyalgia. So now I'm 18 years old. I'm going away to college, yet my mind is focused on learning to live with these chronic conditions. Living away from home, from my family and my doctors, it was really hard. I survived for about 1.5 years until I had another pain episode and ended up spending a week in bed until my family could come and get me. Cue surgery number 3. No matter what birth control pill we tried, including continuous birth control, nothing seemed to work long term. Surgery was the only option, so transferring to a college closer to home seemed like the only logical solution. Endometriosis, it was now dictating my life, but I had no idea it was going to get worse. Since the birth control pills weren't really working, we moved to the next level of treatment, Lupron, a gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist. Hello, medical menopause. I was 21 years old, experiencing hot flashes and mood swings. A once happy and carefree young adult slowly morphed into this unrecognizable, unpredictable person who was always angry, anxious, and depressed. I knew I needed help, and I found it in a mood stabilizer. So we added yet another medication to manage the side effects of the hormone therapy. But the Lupron, it did its job. It bought me a couple of years until emergency surgery number 4. Next on the treatment list was adding a Mirena intrauterine device, or IUD, on top of another round of Lupron treatment. With every Lupron shot, I gained about 10 pounds. So after 2 rounds of Lupron treatment, I had gained close to 60 pounds. Despite this tremendous weight gain, it was worth it because for a little bit of time, I finally felt like me again. I finally graduated from college and began graduate school for my doctorate in marine science. Again, my decision to stay close to home, it was dictated by my need to be close to my support system and my doctors. It was becoming apparent that I would need surgery every 18 to 24 months, no matter what we tried. It was exhausting. My life became this vicious cycle of surgery, followed by playing catch up with school. I was either drowning in schoolwork or sickness. My relationships suffered. Sometimes friends and family, they just didn't understand what I was going through. This was my life, and it got really dark. I was 23 years old. Like clockwork, surgery number 5, it came and it went. Another round of Lupron was tried, resulting in these horrible side effects, including deep bone pain, so treatment was stopped. We were out of options. Before I knew it, surgery number 6 was here, and my doctor persuaded me to consider trying to have a baby, concerned that fertility would be compromised from both the endometriosis and the multiple surgeries. So at 25 years old, my partner and I decided we would try. This was a huge decision because it would mean I couldn't use the available medical options to treat my endometriosis. We tried to conceive for about 2 years until I couldn't take the pain anymore. Approaching surgery number 7, my doctor urged me to see an endometriosis specialist who used the new Da Vinci robotic system. Recovery was a nightmare, and I spent a week in the hospital recovering from what doctors believed was a post-operative thunderclap headache after a spinal tap ruled out meningitis. Even though I had an endometriosis specialist using the newest technology, this surgeon was just not familiar with how my endometriosis presents and likely didn't remove enough of the lesions to really clean me out. So within a year, I was looking at surgery number 8. But this time, things were different. I knew I couldn't do it anymore. My body was telling me it was done. So it was time to do the extreme and remove my ovaries. We delayed surgery so we could squeeze in a round of IVF. Thankfully, we were very successful. My doctor recruited a gynecologic oncologist to perform the surgery with the Da Vinci. But this time, she insisted on being present in the surgery to guide this new surgeon to my lesions so that I could be cleaned out as best as possible. Despite being advised otherwise, I chose to keep my uterus in the hope of one day carrying our children. At 28 years old, I chose sterilization. I'm now 36. I'm postmenopausal with vaginal atrophy, vaginal dryness, and pre-osteoporosis, but I have been surgery-free for 8 years. If it wasn't for my mother advocating for her child and my doctor's expertise, I would have been just another woman suffering through painful periods that never would have gone on to achieve a doctorate, let alone become a professor. Choosing to undergo an oophorectomy, it was the hardest decision of my life, but it ultimately gave me my life back. I found the light at the end of my tunnel. So although endometriosis is a chronic and often debilitating condition, there is hope. Webinars like this offer a glimpse of a brighter future. I believe that as our voices are heard and our stories are told, we will inspire scientists, researchers, and doctors to think outside the box and develop the groundbreaking treatments we've all been waiting for. Thank you for the opportunity to share my story. To everyone living with endometriosis, know that your pain is real, that you're not alone, you're incredibly strong, and you are a survivor. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really want all of us to take to heart that this is a very common disorder, that Sabrina's story is unfortunately by no way unique, but I also congratulate you on the perseverance and the last 8 years, which have allowed you to really reclaim your life, but of course only after many years of difficulty and unfortunately removal of your ovaries, which is certainly not what we're attempting to achieve with our therapies in this world. So if we could go to the next slide, which I think is just a photo of me. You've already heard me briefly be introduced. Again, I'm an OBGYN, reproductive endocrinologist, with a long history of interest in this disorder. Either's fine. First, as a clinician caring for these patients, as well as my work funding endometriosis research while at NIH, as well as more recently working on a potential endometriosis therapeutic while at Bayer Pharmaceuticals that unfortunately is not going to move forward. So I thought about this disorder from many perspectives. But as I told you today, I will just provide the usual background that we need to know when thinking about endometriosis. So what's the definition? Endometriosis is defined as the presence of endometrium, lining of the uterus, or endometrial-like tissue outside of the uterine cavity. And this is most commonly in the pelvis, but actually can be at very distant sites, for example, the lungs. It occurs, again, quite frequently, estimated to be 10% of all reproductive age women, which calculates out to about 66 million women in the US and 190 million women worldwide. As we've just heard, it can present at a very young age, with 20% of women with endo presenting with very severe first menstrual periods, and 60% developing substantial symptoms by the time that they're 20. It is probably the majority cause of pelvic pain in this population, as well as a substantial cause of infertility. Let's move to the right. Sabrina mentioned that some of her surgeons may not have been able to do an adequate surgical resection of the disorder. And there are many reasons for this. One is that the presentation can vary wildly. The classic is the powder burn, blue-black lesions with some scarring shown in the top, but there can also be clear lesions. There can be severe scarring and abnormality shown there in the stage 4 photo. There can also be growth of endometrium into the ovary with a lot of bleeding causing what they call a chocolate cyst, just because the old blood, I guess, looks dark brown. So many presentations. And in fact, if you biopsy areas of the lining, the peritoneal lining, you'll find endometriosis frequently. So there's a lot of subclinical microscopic disease in these patients. Well, how does endometriosis occur? What's the etiology? The most common and probably most likely etiology for the majority of patients is so-called retrograde menstruation. We know with menses that the uterus contracts, the majority of the blood and tissue is pulled through the cervix, but of course quite a bit of it can also be pushed back through the fallopian tubes into the pelvis. In most women, this tissue dies, the immune system cleans it up, and that's that till the next month. But in a subset of patients, for reasons we don't fully understand, this tissue actually sticks, attracts blood vessels, so nutrition attracts nervous system, neural components, which are related to the pain these patients experience. And so this, again, the subset of women develops the disorder endo. There are other causes, but we won't go into those there. That's probably the most common reason. So what are the disease characteristics? Well, it's a chronic heterogeneous disease. And by heterogeneous, I mean both in presentation, as we've just talked about, as well as in symptoms. We'll talk more about symptoms in a moment, but you've heard about many of them already. We've recently begun to appreciate that it's a systemic disease, so a full body disease, an inflammatory disorder with substantial contributions from immune abnormalities. And this is actually provided a new direction for potential treatments for this disorder, and as you'll see, is relevant to the discussion that we'll have later about HCQ. Now, just to explain a bit about the reason for some of the treatments that, again, will be outlined in a moment, like the normal endometrium, endometriosis grows under the influence of estrogen. So that is why things like Lupron, which create menopause, can help with endometriosis, although certainly with marked side effects that you just heard about. Now, the normal endometrium is usually prevented from growing by progestins. So that is why things like the IUD, the progestin-releasing IUD, can be used. Unfortunately, unlike the eutopic endometrium, endometriosis tends to be molecularly resistant to progesterone treatment, which is why progestin-containing approaches can be helpful, but are not always the end-all be-all of the treatment that we want. And again, as shown here, better understanding of its inflammatory components, systemic inflammatory components. Next slide, please. So how is the diagnosis made? Well, the gold standard is surgery, frequently laparoscopy with biopsy, and histologic confirmation of the presence of endometriosis. This, of course, means that you need to have surgery to have a formally receive the diagnosis. And there are many reasons why a woman and her physicians might want to delay going to invasive surgery. And as I said, even with surgery, lesions can be missed. Imaging can certainly pick up larger lesions and those endometriomas, but has somewhat limited sensitivity, except in the most sophisticated hands, although there is definitely work going to improve imaging modalities for diagnosis. And I think that there may be some people representing these attempts on the call today. Similarly, there are biomarker panels being explored that may help for non-invasive diagnosis of endometriosis, but unfortunately, none of these are FDA approved at the moment. So between the early presentation, the need for surgery, etc., the variety of presentations, the diagnosis is has been reported to be delayed between 7 and 10 years, during which time women are really undergoing a lot of very disruptive symptomatology. The disease is progressing as well. And obviously, this is an area that needs a lot of focus. Symptoms, as we've talked about, primary is pelvic pain. This may be intermittent, particularly associated with menses, or particularly with time may become chronic. May occur with intercourse, with urination, or with bowel movements. As you can imagine, though, if the primary presentation for an individual woman is with bowel movements, then they go down the path of GI evaluation, which can lead to missing the diagnosis for many more years. They often have abnormal menstrual bleeding or heavy bleeding, again, as we heard about, infertility, fatigue, and may have pregnancy complications if they do conceive, including preterm birth, placenta previa, postpartum hemorrhage, etc. Well, what about associated disorders? Again, very long list. This is just partial, certainly highly associated with autoimmune disorders, including lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, association with migraines, with depression. Well known to be associated with subtypes of ovarian cancer. In more recent data suggesting an association with breast cancer as well as melanoma. So to what degree this is underlying common pathophysiology or the presence of endometriosis further activating immune systems and increasing risk is all huge areas of study at the moment. But clearly, these associated disorders are within their cells cause significant morbidity or even mortality, which makes better understanding endometriosis and potentially treating it earlier very important. Next slide, please. So, pretty clear by now that endometriosis has a significant negative impact on health-related quality of life. And I just want to point out that this is certainly true for the patient, but it doesn't only impact her, right? It impacts everyone around her, family, friends, people she works with, society at large. And there are many different reasons for this. And of course, it varies on the situation. But really, this is not just that patient's issue. And so, I think further emphasizes the importance of appropriately and improving our treatments. There's not only a quality of life burden, but there's a financial burden. This study by Simeons, I've got references at the bottom, estimated a cost in the US alone of up to $69 billion per year. And in fact, other studies estimate an even higher cost. And this also shows huge areas for medical savings in this field that would certainly be very nice to achieve for multiple reasons. And then here I'm just reminding you that, although endometriosis is well known to most on this call, it really has not received the attention diagnostically or therapeutically or even in basic science relative to many of these other conditions that we talk about much more frequently. So let's now move to the next slide. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Kotlyar, who's principal investigator for SLBST. He completed a residency at Cleveland Clinic, where he published work with Tommaso Falcone. My apologies for butchering the names. He then completed a fellowship in REI at Yale, publishing with Hugh Taylor. And for those that don't know, these are very high profile, names in this field. So he received very good background training and then began to contribute himself to this field. He currently works at Genesis Fertility and Reproductive Medicine in New York. I think it's worth noting that he received an SRI Bayer Discovery Innovation Award to work on his to support his work on the treatment of endometriosis. So he continues this focus both in his clinical work and his role with SLBST and some research projects. I will now turn this screen over to you, Alex. Next slide, please.
Lisa, thank you so much for that terrific introduction. So as mentioned, I'm Alex Kotlyar, the principal investigator for SLBST, and I'm going to go into current treatments and the new frontier that SLBST has to offer with treatment for endometriosis with hydroxychloroquine. So as touched on by both Sabrina and by Lisa, the treatment options are multimodal. The first level are pain medications, NSAIDs or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen, naproxen, and so on. Then you also have opioids like oxycodone. And efficacy, at least in several studies, has been not entirely clear or equivocal compared to placebo. In addition, both medications or all pain medications have their associated side effects. For NSAIDs, gastric effects in very high doses, renal side effects and renal damage. And for opioids, of course, the very well-known and well-publicized risk of dependency. The concomitant or potential next step is with hormone modulation, which I would say is the mainstay for the majority of patients undergoing medical treatment. And that often begins with combined oral contraceptives with estrogen and progesterone. And when you have supplemental estrogen, one major drawback is the increase in blood clot risk, DVT, as we say, and then progestins alone, either orally or with the Mirena IUD. Then you also have aromatase inhibitors. The common one being used is letrozole, that decreases estrogen in the body or prevents the body from producing estrogen. And as a result, it can lead to those quote unquote menopausal side effects, hot flashes, night sweats. For patients that just don't respond to those treatments, they can use danazol, which is a testosterone derivative, which helps prevent or reduce the production of estrogen and also helps starve endometriosis of the estrogen that it depends upon. More profound effects are seen with GnRH analogs, and those are medications like Lupron. And over the past 7 years, a new class of medications called GnRH antagonists, which can be taken orally. The first member of that is called elagolix or Orilissa, and there are a few more options now. Both of them prevent the ovaries from or suppress the system that helps produce estrogen for the human body. And for those, as Sabrina very well delineated, you have those menopausal like side effects, the hot flashes, night sweats, the vaginal dryness. In addition, they're limited by their duration of use. If they're just used alone, really you should only use them for no more than 6 months. If it's with some sort of add back or supportive therapy, then you can go up for up to 2 years, but you really should take a break afterwards. In lieu of medical treatment, many patients opt to do surgery, especially for both diagnostic and therapeutic purposes. And as mentioned, surgery also has its very significant limitations. When we go into a patient's body and we look for these lesions, we're limited by what we can see. Doesn't matter whether you're using your eyes or whether you're doing this through the robot, we are limited by what we can see. And even then, once we remove what we can see, it doesn't mean we're removing everything. Endometriosis can arise in places that just aren't easily visible during surgery, and oftentimes aren't visible on imaging. And as a consequence, many of these patients, if they don't get medical treatment promptly after their surgery, they have a very high chance of recurrence, especially within the first several years after their surgery. As Sabrina's case very, very starkly illustrated. And as a consequence, many of these patients are on concomitant or subsequent medical therapy. They're oftentimes taking pain medications for acute exacerbations, often with opioids, and that has a profound effect on their quality of life and their physical and mental well-being, with 2 times the number of patients with endometriosis taking antidepressants compared to the general population. And what I wish to highlight here is that these treatments, especially the hormonal treatments, they are focused on the estrogen dependence of endometriosis. But we know so much more about endometriosis in that there are numerous abnormal features of it, especially with immune cells and immune signaling. Next slide, please. So we see abnormalities in the innate and in the adaptive immune systems. We see upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines. This not only affects the immune cells themselves and their signaling and their ability to clear these lesions, but they also help the lesions take hold and flourish. In addition, many of these abnormally elevated immune signals increase immune cell recruitment, fibroblast recruitment, leading to more scar tissue, which has its own effects on pain and on fertility also, and on nerve fiber growth, leading to this phenomenon that unfortunately many endometriosis patients experience, which is central sensitization, where a pain stimulus that normally wouldn't bother most patients is very bothersome for endometriosis patients. So it's all a complicating cycle with a very, very distinct immune background. Next slide, please. Begs the question, what are we doing to address this? What can we do to address this? Well, I'm first going to say that we are not directly addressing this. I mean, one could make the argument that decreasing estrogen does have an impact on immune function. Yes, but that's at best an indirect effect. And the very tantalizing reality is that we have this group of medications used for decades and that are very well characterized from an efficacy and a safety perspective called disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. And hydroxychloroquine is one of the oldest, one of the safest, and best characterized of all these medications. Next slide, please. So as touched on before, endometriosis has this very clear immune aspect to it. And there are numerous studies linking endometriosis with various autoimmune conditions, like lupus, like inflammatory bowel diseases. And there's more and more data, and I just have to mention a paper that I did with my colleagues back at Yale. It was a Lancet review emphasizing that endometriosis is a systemic inflammatory disease. Part of the issue that has, I would say, encumbered the development of further treatments is considering it just a pelvic or local gynecologic disease. That is not the case. It is much more profound than that. And so we need a much more profound treatment. So clearly there is an immune-based problem that we are just not addressing. And hydroxychloroquine is a very tantalizing solution for that. So we're replacing or supplementing hormone modulation with immune regulation. Another factor that's really important about hydroxychloroquine is that many women trying to get pregnant are taking it, and once they are pregnant, they can continue taking it. So hydroxychloroquine offers the chance to have an endometriosis treatment that allows women to finally conceive while taking it and to continue taking it while they're pregnant, because it is very safe and very well characterized in pregnancy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into some of the nuts and bolts behind the immune dysregulation in endometriosis. So on the left panel, we can see some of the cytokines and these immune signals that are pro-inflammatory and contribute to this pro-inflammatory environment in patients with endometriosis. Going to the right hand panel, we can see that hydroxychloroquine inhibits and decreases the effects of many of these same cytokines. And as shown in the previous slide, that can not only affect this generalized inflammatory state, but perhaps can also affect lesion progression. Next slide, please. In addition to affecting cytokines, there Hydroxychloroquine has been implicated in multiple mechanisms as far as how it influences the immune system. It affects Toll-like receptors in macrophages and in other members of the innate immune system. There's calcium signaling, and there's an effect on how macrophages, one of the key initial immune cell responders that have been well studied in endometriosis. It also affects how these macrophages differentiate into a pro-inflammatory versus an anti-inflammatory subset. Macrophages are also heavily involved in autophagy and in taking up cellular debris. So endometriosis can also modify that too. It can also affect the autophagy ability or the uptake ability of potentially endometriotic lesions also. Next slide also. So I'm going to go into some of the preclinical and the clinical data concerning hydroxychloroquine. So in a study in 2016, Ruiz and Njundin and colleagues, they looked at a mouse model of endometriosis. And when they compared mice treated with saline versus hydroxychloroquine, they found a 60% reduction in the number of endometriosis lesions, which is extremely striking and stark. And half the mice exposed to hydroxychloroquine did not develop any endometriotic lesions at all. So mouse models have historically been a template for what we potentially would expect in humans. And based upon this, this sparked a few additional clinical studies that I'll go into very shortly. Next slide, please. My colleagues and I at the Cleveland Clinic did a retrospective review of 250 patients with surgically confirmed endometriosis, looking to see any effects of disease-modifying antirheumatic drugs on these patients. In those that took these disease-modifying antirheumatic drugs, they had approximately a 2/3 lower use of opioids, and 40% of the DMARDs used were hydroxychloroquine. Hence, from this study, it suggested that patients with surgically confirmed endometriosis treated with hydroxychloroquine potentially may have fewer pain side effects and reinforce the idea that hydroxychloroquine could be having a very beneficial effect in patients with endometriosis. Next slide. A subsequent study from a group in Taiwan looked at patients with systemic lupus erythematosus who were treated with hydroxychloroquine for less than 90 days versus more than 90 days. They chose that cutoff because approximately 90 days or 3 months is necessary for a steady state of hydroxychloroquine to build up in the body, for a therapeutic level to build up. And those patients that were treated for more than 90 days, they had 50% less endometriosis and endometriosis diagnoses compared to patients that took it for less than 90 days. So further additional retrospective data supporting the idea that hydroxychloroquine is having a very profound effect on the development and potentially the proliferation of endometriosis in women. Next slide. So just to summarize, endometriosis is a very common, chronic, debilitating disease, and I would emphasize a chronic systemic inflammatory disease too. Current treatment is very limited, and this may seem like a very strong phrase, but especially as a physician who treats many endometriosis patients, especially for their fertility needs, with surgery and pain medications and with hormonal modulation, this has been done for decades. We are beating a few very tired horses. We need a new frontier. We know that there are aspects of the pathology behind endometriosis, namely the immune aspects that just aren't being addressed, but that we know have a profound effect. And hydroxychloroquine, it's the only medication that has not only the preclinical, but also some clinical data indicating that it might be effective in these patients. In addition, it is the only medication that has the possibility to treat endometriosis and allow women to try to conceive, which would be a paradigm shift in treatment. So I just want to thank everyone for their attention, and I'll give the floor back to Lisa.
Next slide, please. And I think I may be giving the floor back to Dan or to Mark. Dan, mute.
Yeah, hey, actually, let's pass back to Doug Nissinoff at University of South Florida to be our moderator for the questions.
Agreed.
Doug?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, if I can direct your attention to the top of the screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. Please do go ahead and ask any questions. We're opening the floor, and I will be reading them as they come in. So let's take a look here. I can see in the queue already we have one, so published. Okay, so given HCQ's long history of use and its established safety profile in women of childbearing age, can you elaborate on how this aligns with your approach in targeting endometriosis patients? Specifically, what unique advantages does HCQ offer compared to current hormonal treatments in terms of safety and long-term management? I'm going to guess this is a good question for Beat, but I'll, Dan, Mark, do you agree with that one?
I concur. Beat, you're on mute, but if you could unmute, and then if you want to, you can address that or any other comments you have.
I think you're still on mute there, Beat. You might want to try clicking on the microphone button, which is in the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah. Possibly we ask either Dr. Kotlyar or Dr. Halvorson to respond to Albert.
So I can absolutely weigh in on this. So hydroxychloroquine, it doesn't have any of the side effects of these of hormonal medications. It doesn't have the DVT risk for combined oral contraceptives. Doesn't have the potential mental health side effects with potential 20% risk of depressive side effects with progestins. And it has been very well characterized over the past 5 decades plus. And the only really significant side effect that could cause any alarm could be potentially some uveitis, but that's only seen with very high doses taken over years. And Viet will weigh in on this for actually approaching a decade or more of use. But even then, the chance of that happening is extremely small. And in addition, it doesn't have any of the extremely bothersome and in the long term potentially dangerous low estrogen side effects that you can see with aromatase inhibitors with GnRH analogs. So that's my response in a nutshell.
Thank you. Anyone else from the team want to further address it or move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's move on to the next question. I think that summarizes it all.
Great, thank you very much. So Amresh Block is asking, do any of the current endometriosis treatments actually reverse the disease? And to clarify, he says, I meant, do any of the current endometriosis drug treatments actually reverse the disease?
Yeah, perhaps Lisa, would you want to speak to that?
Sure, I can, or Alex can. I mean, I think to the degree that we understand it, the current treatments, obviously excision, decreases the number of lesions that are present, and hormonal treatments, those that decrease estrogen and or increase progesterone probably also decrease the number of lesions and their progression. But none of these are curative. Primarily because as long as there is some ongoing estrogen stimulation and any kind of endometrial menstrual period that can reseed the peritoneum, the disease will just continue to either redevelop or to progress further. We're never quite sure that it's totally been eliminated, and I suspect it generally is not with any of the current treatments.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Anybody else have anything to add to that? Okay, great. So Amish, if you have any other follow-up or further questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. I do see another question that came in. It says, how should we address misconceptions that arose during COVID about hydroxychloroquine's use, particularly for conditions like endometriosis?
Pia, do you want to address that, or are you still unable to unmute yourself? Okay.
Yeah.
I will make a brief statement on the experience and collection of our references from the COVID experience. It's largely believed that there was some efficacy in vitro as far as its effect on virus itself, but those doses were extremely high on average, and it was used in patients who were literally on ICU beds. And so I think the comparison is not necessarily the same. Having said that, I'd be more than happy to, or any of our scientific experts can address that question individually, and happy to do so.
Great, thank you, Dan. I'm seeing a few more questions roll in here.
Please.
So since HCQ is already widely used for lupus, what would the process look like for expanding its use in endometriosis patients?
I think that's a good question, and I'm happy to have a one-on-one dialogue with anyone about that in particular, because it involves the commercialization of largely what may be known as a generically available drug. Having said that, we're looking for a specific FDA approval for a new indication. And so we would be exclusive to that level of commercial, I'm going to say marketing side of it. The dose of HCQ used for endometriosis would be largely different than what's available commercially today. However, this lends to what Lisa was referencing, which is we have a unique opportunity to be cost savings on the side of being a direct benefit to patients who are suffering from endometriosis. So what that really bottom line means that we're not going to be in excess of what our ability to charge, and the cost of the HCQ therapy for endo would be rather cost savings compared to anything else that's available.
Excellent, thanks, Dan. It looks like we only have one more question left in the queue, so if anyone in the audience has any more questions, please do put it in the Q&A now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up after this question, but it's a pretty simple one. So this is helpful. Can I receive your slides, and will there be more webinars?
Absolutely. Our commitment is to be able to, I'm going to say, report the progress of the company on a biannual basis. We are poised to start our phase 2 program. We would love to share any interim data that's available. And our commitment is to follow up. So, the benefit of being a small company at this stage is to be able to respond to the demands and responses that we may get from programs like this. And so our commitment, especially from myself and Mark, would be to address any and all questions, any requests, including copies of our slide deck. We'd be happy to send it to you as well. And I think the next slide has our contact information. So feel free to call or email me with anything that is of concern or question, and we'd be happy to address it. But before our contact appears, I'm going to introduce Mark again. Mark is going to summarize what we went over, and we would love an opportunity to dialogue if there are any questions.
Yeah, Dan, thank you so much. And many thanks to our speakers today, particularly Sabrina, our endo warrior, who so very bravely shared her difficult struggle over the course of the last 2 decades, and our physician researchers, Dr. Lisa Halvorson, Dr. Alex Kotlyar, who gave us an overview and then reviewed the groundwork that underlays what we're doing here at SLBST Pharma. So what I'd like to do is leave you with 4 takeaway messages from these presentations. First, endometriosis is a large unmet need market. And Sabrina's just one of millions of women who battle endometriosis. The takeaway is there is no tolerable, no safe, no successful therapy to manage endometriosis. And Alex pointed out a study, a 2019 study showing that women with endo use 3 times the number of opioids and twice the number of antidepressants compared to the population at large. We are not treating endometriosis. We are simply covering up its effects. Point number 2, SLBST is working on a reformulation of hydroxychloroquine to normalize the disrupted inflammatory response. And there are multiple advantages to this. There have been a number of approaches over the decades. Companies, researchers have looked at limiting angiogenesis, limiting innervation. There are a number of trials on the way looking at ways to address the inflammatory axis. But in general, they're looking at single cytokine pathways, single prostaglandin inhibitors, and always in any drug development program, tolerability and side effects are big issues that come up. The advantage in what SLBST is doing is we're looking at a broad normalization rather than cutting off any particular channel. We're looking to broadly normalize the immune system. A third takeaway, we believe that SLBST's reformulated hydroxychloroquine has the potential to be first in market, non-hormonal, and a long-term treatment. And we're basing that belief off the existing use case of hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for lupus. There are 1.5 million lupus patients in the US. 90% of those patients are women, and 84% of lupus patients take hydroxychloroquine on a long-term basis. So what that means is there are roughly 1 million people today who are taking hydroxychloroquine on a long-term basis to manage a disease. We believe that has potential to carry over well into the endometriosis application. Finally, SLBST is looking to solve the side effect dilemma. All therapies have side effects, and we've heard the GnRH analogs, Lupron or lisomifimbre. They're effective, but their side effects limit their use to something like 10, maybe at the most 30,000 patients, where, as Lisa pointed out, there are over 6 million, almost 7. At SLBST, we believe, subject to success in phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, that our reformulated hydroxychloroquine could become a very broadly applicable therapy to treat the pain of endometriosis. So I'll close today with a thank you. If you have additional questions, as Dan mentioned, you can find us at the following contact locations. So you've got Dan's email address, his phone, my email address, my phone. You can look for us on the SLBST Pharma webpage. And finally, you can look for us, reach us on the LinkedIn page for SLBST Pharma. Once again, thank you to all our speakers, and thank you for all of our attendees for listening to this presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.